visiting with my old friend.
What do you mean old?
Well, my new friend. Let's see, let's just play a flute and see what it sounds like. Here we are, sitting before a microphone, which is a strange contraption invented by the white man to strike fear into the souls of the Indian.
Okay, good morning. I have with me my guest, Dr. Richard Payne, a retired physician here in Oklahoma City and very world-renowned expert on flutes, in particular the American Indian flute. Good morning, Dr. Payne. I'm glad to have you here.
Good morning. It's a small world if I'm world-renowned, but it's been an interest of mine for many years. I've had the advantage of being in the midst of Indian culture since my birth, which was in Bartlesville in 1918. I've maintained a strong interest in Indian music and in particular the Indian flute, which is the embodiment of Indian music.
Dr. Payne, do you remember your first occasion where you heard the Indian flute play?
I don't remember. As you know, for a long period of time, the Indians were not particularly outgoing in presenting their culture, and much of the Indian music and Indian ceremonial was done more or less surreptitiously. It hasn't been until probably the last 25 or 30 years that the Indian has shown a resurgence in his outgoing interest in presenting his music. I suppose you'd say pride in so doing, and so Indian music has become much more prominent in that period of time. But I think that probably my earliest recollections are not brought into my conscious memory, but they must have been quite early in my childhood, as I've always been interested in whistles and flutes. I did have an old grandfather who was Holland Dutch, who played the penny whistle. This undoubtedly had considerable input in my interest in this particular realm. I might say that the Indian flute player who is most foremost in my memory is, of course, Bulow Cozad, who was the last of the great Kiowa flute players. Bulow was a flute maker. He made beautiful flutes out of cedar and played a rather limited repertory, but a very deep-feeling type of music on the flute. Bulow died in 1947. The tradition of music has been maintained in the Cozad family, but there are no Cozad flute players around at the present time. Everett Cozad did play for a while, but I don't believe that he's playing now. But Bulow was a great man, highly respected by the Kiowas, a great proponent of the Indian flute, and I'm fortunate to have one of Bulow's flutes and treasure it very highly.
Could you describe what that flute looks like, a little bit about how it's made or its design?
Bulow made his flutes of cedar. He chose his cedar very carefully. Many of the flutes, or he didn't make that many, but the flutes that I've seen were made from cedar that had been seasoned for long periods of time, cedar that had been used in teepee poles or in meat poles, poles upon which the meat was hung to dry, and was therefore seasoned very well, and thus not likely to check or split when exposed to the stresses of being played as a flute. He shaved the wood very carefully and hollowed it out to a very thin wall. His flutes measured about 1 inch in internal bore, thus produced a very hollow, low harmonic sound. The halves of the flute, after being hollowed out, were bound together with thongs. Glue that was used to glue the halves together is not entirely clear to me. I was told that this was glue from the compass plant, though I've never been able to find such glue, and this was unfortunately a secret that I didn't come away with. In any event, the flutes were bound together. The seal was not very perfect, and so they were better played after being soaked overnight to swell the wood and to swell and to tighten the bindings. And thus their tone wouldn't change upon playing as the moisture from the breath swelled the wood. He had a somewhat different method of producing the fipple point in that he used either lead sheet or tin from a tin can. Generally, he seemed to prefer Prince Albert tins to make the fipple point. Thus, he didn't use what we call a nest, made this fipple point, which he could bend to produce best sound. It's not a bad idea even today to do that, though the later development and other makers have had a little bit of advantage in using the so-called nest or the additional plate to separate the bird from the roost.
Dr. Payne, the flute has always been considered a Plains Indian instrument. Could you comment on that? Are there other tribes you're aware of besides the Kiowa tribe that played the Indian flute?
Well, this is a great argument. I call the Plains flute the Taos flute, but I've been corrected by musicologists in that who prefer to call it the Plains flute. I have no argument with that. The so-called Plains flute certainly shows up in the northern tribes and eastern tribes. It's pretty much a universal instrument at the present time. Question is how old it is. I would not venture a guess as to the age of what we now call Plains flute. I call it the Taos flute because Taos was the meeting place of all of the western tribes at one time, and much of what we now see did have its origins, if not in Taos, it showed up in Taos in short order. I say that the juniper, the development of the juniper flute, which is the Plains flute, did take place in Taos, and we have evidences of very old Taos flutes and flutes that come a little bit north of that in the Ute country. The Utes, particularly the northern Utes, seem to develop the flute at a very early stage, again radiating probably from Taos. Our culture certainly in many respects did radiate from Taos. Indians did migrate down the Cimarron, cross into Oklahoma. This was a very prominent trade route. Probably the flute did originate in the Hopi area, Papago area, those areas, and then further developed using juniper instead of cane into the plains area. I wouldn't argue about whether it's what to call it, whether to call it plains or whether to call it Taos. I have been corrected so many times calling it Taos that I really no longer do that, and am content to call it plains. Of course, the Iroquois, the Seneca, the Winnebago, the Omaha, all of these people have flutes of some antiquity. Perhaps they would object to calling this flute the plains flute. I think the Omaha seem to call it the Winnebago flute. And of course, there's not too much difference between the Winnebago and the Omaha. They have kind of a common origin. The problem with the Indian, as you know, ideas travel fast. The moccasin telegraph is an extremely efficient, rapid means of communication, and an Indian will see an idea in Timbuktu, and before you know it, pretty widespread.
Dr. Payne, you make a lot of flutes. Can you contrast and compare the differences between the modern contemporary flute and the old-style flute? There are some flutes 5-hole, some 6-hole.
Yes, well, the original Indian flute was not, of course, tonal. The Indian's ear was tuned to the pentatonic scale, which is a wonderful scale, and that it's based upon harmonics which do not clash ordinarily, which lend one the opportunity of playing almost anything and having something rather pleasant come out. The old Indians, I think, had a dearth of songs. They would have their song, one song, which they had complete proprietorship. I think that they would bore their flute to the tones of that particular song. They were identified by that song. They could be heard from the distance the sound traveled, and one would know exactly who that Indian was. The rather universal pentatonic scale did come out eventually as the white man entered into the picture, I suppose, probably after the ghost dance fiasco. The Indian gave up and did become more and more tonal and more structured in his music. From that, a more structured pentatonic scale, a more universal pentatonic scale developed. This is generally a 5-tone scale. From there, the diatonic scale developed. To my ear, of course, the diatonic scale is more progressive. It's been my feeling that this scale should be developed to the point that the flute will lend itself to playing rather universal music, white man's music, if you will, to present the flute as a distinctive musical instrument upon which a variety of music can be played.
What was the original purpose of the flute, Dr. Payne? Was it really to court the women, or does it have some spiritual ceremony significance?
Well, a great deal is made of the courting nature of the Indian flute, and I think that probably it is an instrument which is reflective. I don't think necessarily for courting. I think that was a function of the flute. I think that the flute had ceremonial purposes. It could be used for supplication for rain or for harmonious acts of nature. I think that it identified the player, as I say. It had a distinctive tone which was characteristic of the player. I think that it could have been a warning signal. to the village, as I think that it was possible that the flute player could travel around the village and play in a certain way that would alert the populace of the village of perhaps a danger or other signals which might be of interest. I'm sure that it had a diversity of nature of uses. The common thing, of course, is that the flute was used as a courting instrument, that the Indian would go down by the river and he would play his flute. The maiden would hear his flute and be able to identify the player, and if she showed up, then this would be the initial step in the courting. And that's a beautiful story and undoubtedly true. In some tribes, there is a great fear of the flute, that it's a courting device which cannot be denied by the Indian maiden, and that it is the seducer, therefore has been held in somewhat fear and trepidation by these tribes, that it will break up the family. Some tribes feel that the flute should only be played by the very young man, and that once he is married and goes on the warpath, whatever, that he should abandon the flute. Other tribe is played by older men, medicine men, if you will. So there's a great variety, and one's imagination can take up where I leave off.